The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red uniform for what he believed would be the last time. After 32 years of faithful service to the Crown, today marked his final day as a member of the Queen's Guard. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he polished the brass buttons that had gleamed through countless ceremonies, state visits, and royal celebrations. Thomas had joined the Guard as a young man of 20, full of dreams and pride. He remembered his first day clearly, the weight of the bearskin hat, the responsibility of protecting the royal family, and the overwhelming sense of honor that came with wearing the scarlet tunic. Over the decades, he had stood motionless through rain and shine, witnessed historic moments, and dedicated his life to service without ever seeking recognition. As he walked through the castle grounds one last time before his shift, memories flooded back. He recalled the day Prince William was born, the jubilant celebrations, the weddings, and the quiet moments when the royal family would pass by during their daily routines. Thomas had always maintained the required stoic expression, never allowing himself to show emotion while on duty. But inside, he had grown to care deeply for the family he protected. The other guards nodded respectfully as he passed. Word had spread quickly through the ranks about his retirement. Thomas Mitchell was a legend among them, a man who had never missed a day of duty, who had mentored countless young guardsmen, and who embodied everything the Queen's Guard represented. His colleagues knew that his departure would leave a void that would be difficult to fill. Thomas made his way to his final post outside the state apartments. The familiar weight of his rifle felt different today. Knowing it would be the last time he would stand guard, he had requested this particular position for his farewell duty because it held special significance. This was where he had first been stationed 3 decades ago, and it seemed fitting to end his career where it had begun. As he took his position, Thomas allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about his late wife, Margaret, who had supported him throughout his career, understanding the demands and sacrifices that came with his duty. She had passed away 2 years earlier, and since then, the Guard had become even more important to him. It was his family, his purpose, his identity. The castle began to stir with activity as staff prepared for the day ahead. Thomas straightened his shoulders and assumed his ceremonial stance, becoming the living statue that tourists would photograph and children would stare at in wonder. But today felt different. There was an electricity in the air, though he couldn't quite place why. Unknown to Thomas, word of his retirement had reached the royal family. Prince George, now 10 years old and growing more aware of the people who worked tirelessly to protect his family, had been told about the Guard who was ending his remarkable career. The young prince had listened intently as his father explained the dedication and sacrifice that men like Sergeant Mitchell made, serving with honor and loyalty for decades without fanfare or recognition. Prince George had always been curious about the Guards. Unlike many children who saw them as living statues or tourist attractions, he understood they were real people with families and feelings. His parents had taught him to respect and appreciate those who served the royal household, and this lesson had taken root in his young heart. As the morning progressed, Thomas maintained his vigilant watch, unaware that this day would become one he would remember for the rest of his life. The stone walls around him had witnessed centuries of history, and today, they would witness a moment of pure human connection that would touch hearts far beyond the castle grounds. The sounds of the castle continued around him. Footsteps on stone, distant conversations, the rustle of leaves in the ancient oak trees. Thomas had heard these same sounds thousands of times before, but today they seemed more poignant, more meaningful. He was storing up these final moments, these last sensory memories of a career that had defined his adult life. Little did he know that somewhere within those castle walls, a young prince was preparing to do something that would honor not just Thomas's service, but represent a new generation's understanding of respect, gratitude, and human dignity. The stage was set for a moment that would remind everyone present why service to others, recognition of sacrifice, and simple human kindness remain the most powerful forces in our world. Prince George sat in his morning lessons, but his mind kept wandering to the conversation he had overheard the previous evening. His parents had been discussing Sergeant Mitchell's retirement with the head of security, and something about their tone had caught the young prince's attention. They spoke of the Guard with such respect and admiration that George felt compelled to learn more. After his tutor dismissed him for a break, George approached his father. Prince William was reviewing some documents in his study when his son knocked gently on the door. The future king looked up with a warm smile, always happy to make time for his children no matter how busy his schedule might be. George asked about the guard who was retiring, and his father's expression grew thoughtful. Prince William explained that Sergeant Mitchell represented the very best of the Queen's Guard, men and women who dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, often at great personal sacrifice. He told his son about Thomas's long career, his unwavering dedication, and how he had become something of a father figure to younger guards joining the service. The prince listened as his father described the loneliness that often came with such duty, standing for hours without movement, missing family gatherings, working through holidays and special occasions. These guards, his father explained, gave up much of their personal lives so that the royal family could live safely and carry out their duties to the nation. Something stirred deep within Prince George's heart as he absorbed these words. At 10 years old, he was beginning to understand the weight of responsibility that came with his position, but he was also developing an acute sense of empathy and justice. The idea that someone could serve so faithfully for so long without proper recognition troubled him. George spent the rest of the morning thinking about Sergeant Mitchell. During lunch, he barely touched his food, his mind racing with thoughts about what it must feel like to end such a significant career. He imagined the guard going home to an empty house, hanging up his uniform for the final time, and facing a future without the purpose that had driven him for 3 decades. After lunch, George found his way to one of the castle's upper windows that overlooked the courtyard where guards were stationed. He could see the familiar red figures standing at their posts, and he wondered which one might be Sergeant Mitchell. From this distance, they all looked the same: identical uniforms, identical postures, identical dedication to duty. The young prince began to formulate an idea. His parents had always taught him that with privilege came responsibility, and that those who served the royal family deserved recognition and gratitude. But this wasn't just about following protocol or fulfilling an obligation. George felt a genuine desire to do something meaningful for this man who had given so much. He thought about the times he had walked past the guards during his daily routines. They had always maintained their stoic expressions, never acknowledging his presence in any way that might break protocol. Yet George had always sensed their watchful protection, their quiet presence ensuring his safety. Now he understood that behind those motionless faces were real people with real feelings, people who cared about his family's well-being. George's plan began to take shape as the afternoon wore on. He knew it would have to be something special, something that would truly honor the guard's service while respecting the formalities that governed royal protocol. Most importantly, it had to come from his heart, not from duty or expectation, but from genuine appreciation for a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others. As evening approached, George sought out his mother. Catherine was in the family's private sitting room, reading by the fireplace. When her son approached with his idea, her eyes filled with tears. The gesture he proposed was simple yet profound, and it perfectly captured the young man he was becoming: thoughtful, compassionate, and deeply aware of others' sacrifices. His mother helped him refine the plan, ensuring it would be appropriate while maintaining its emotional impact. Together, they discussed the importance of recognizing those who served quietly and faithfully, often without thanks or acknowledgement. Catherine was proud of her son's initiative and touched by his genuine concern for someone he had never formally met. That night, as Prince George lay in bed, he felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement about the next day. He understood that his gesture might seem small to some, but he hoped it would mean everything to the man who had devoted his life to protecting the royal family. Tomorrow would be Sergeant Mitchell's last day, and George was determined to ensure it would be a day the guard would never forget. The morning of Sergeant Mitchell's final day arrived with a crisp autumn air that carried the scent of fallen leaves throughout the castle grounds. Thomas had awakened earlier than usual, not from duty but from the restless energy that comes with momentous endings. He dressed slowly, savoring each familiar motion of putting on his uniform, knowing these would be his final preparations as a Queen's Guard. Meanwhile, Prince George had also risen early, his young mind buzzing with anticipation about the plan he and his mother had carefully prepared. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, where Catherine was already waiting with a small, beautifully wrapped package. The gift inside was simple but meaningful, something that would serve as a permanent reminder of appreciation for the guards' faithful service. As Thomas took his final position outside the state apartments, he noticed an unusual energy in the castle that morning. Staff members seemed to be moving with more purpose than usual, and he caught several meaningful glances exchanged between his fellow guards. He wondered if word of his retirement had created this subtle shift in atmosphere, but he dismissed the thought, focusing instead on maintaining his professional bearing for these last hours of duty. Prince George spent the morning in his usual lessons, but his tutor noticed the young prince's distraction. His eyes kept drifting toward the windows, and he seemed eager for the session to end. When finally dismissed for lunch, George didn't head to the dining room as expected. Instead, he made his way to find his parents, the small package clutched carefully in his hands. The plan was set for early afternoon, when the changing of the guard ceremony would provide the perfect opportunity for George's gesture. His parents had coordinated with the head of security to ensure everything would proceed smoothly, while maintaining the dignity and protocol that such moments required. As the time approached, Thomas felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The weight of his duties would soon be lifted from his shoulders, but so would the sense of purpose that had driven him for more than 3 decades. He thought about Margaret and how proud she had always been of his service. She had often joked that he loved the Queen's Guard more than he loved her, but her eyes had always sparkled when she said it, revealing her deep pride in his dedication. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the courtyard when Prince George emerged from the castle's main entrance. Unlike his usual casual walks through the grounds, today he moved with deliberate purpose, his young face set with determination and nervous excitement. Several guards noticed the young prince's unusual demeanor, and word quickly spread among them that something significant was about to happen. Thomas, standing at his post, caught sight of the approaching figure from the corner of his eye. Protocol dictated that he maintain his forward gaze, never acknowledging the royal family's presence while on duty, unless specifically addressed. But something about this moment felt different. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if the very stones of the castle were holding their breath. Prince George approached slowly, each step measured and respectful. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but now that it was actually happening, his heart raced with the weight of what he was about to do. This wasn't just about following through on a kind gesture. It was about honoring someone who had devoted his life to protecting others, someone whose sacrifice deserved recognition. The other guards on duty had subtly shifted their attention, though they maintained their professional postures. They sensed that they were about to witness something extraordinary, something that would become part of the castle's oral history, passed down through generations of guards who would follow in their footsteps. As Prince George drew closer to Sergeant Mitchell's position, the veteran guard felt his heart begin to race. After 32 years of service, he had developed an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings, and every instinct told him that this moment would be unlike any other in his long career. The young prince was walking directly toward him with clear intent, carrying something in his hands that could only be meant for Thomas himself. The castle staff, who had gathered at various windows and doorways, watched in hushed silence as the scene unfolded below them. They understood they were witnessing something special, a moment of pure human connection that transcended rank, protocol, and the formal boundaries that typically separated the royal family from those who served them. The afternoon light seemed to spotlight the two figures as they prepared to meet in what would become an unforgettable encounter. Prince George came to a stop directly in front of Sergeant Mitchell, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The two stood facing each other. The young prince looked up at the tall guard, taking in the weathered face that had remained stoic through countless hours of duty, the kind eyes that had seen decades of royal history unfold, and the slight tremor in the man's hands that betrayed his emotion at this unexpected encounter. Breaking with centuries of protocol, Prince George spoke first. His voice was clear but gentle, carrying the weight of genuine respect that belied his young age. He addressed Sergeant Mitchell by name, acknowledging not just his rank but his humanity. his individual identity beyond the uniform that had defined him for so long. Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. In 32 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever addressed him so directly, so personally. The formal barriers that had always existed between protector and protected seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by something far more profound, a recognition of shared humanity and mutual respect. The young prince began to speak about service, about sacrifice, and about the debt of gratitude that could never truly be repaid. His words were simple but powerful, delivered with a sincerity that moved everyone within earshot. George spoke of how he had learned about the guard's long career, about the countless hours spent protecting his family, and about the personal sacrifices that such dedication required. As Prince George continued, his voice grew stronger, more confident. He talked about the example that Sergeant Mitchell had set for younger guards, about the integrity and honor he had brought to his position, and about how his service had made it possible for the royal family to carry out their duties to the nation. The prince's words painted a picture of heroism, found not in grand gestures but in daily dedication, in the quiet courage of showing up day after day, year after year. Tears began to form in Thomas's eyes as he listened to these words of recognition. For 3 decades he had stood at his posts knowing that his service mattered, but hearing it acknowledged so eloquently by this young prince overwhelmed him with emotion. The weight of all those years, all those sacrifices, all those moments of loneliness and dedication seemed to find their meaning in this unexpected tribute. Prince George then presented the carefully wrapped package to Sergeant Mitchell. Inside was a personalized memento, a crystal paperweight engraved with the guard's name, years of service, and a message of gratitude from the royal family. It wasn't valuable in monetary terms, but its worth as a symbol of recognition and appreciation was immeasurable. The guard's hands shook as he accepted the gift, the first time in his entire career that protocol had been set aside to allow such a personal exchange. The weight of the crystal seemed to represent the weight of his years of service, now formally acknowledged and honored by the family he had protected for so long. But Prince George wasn't finished. With a gesture that would be remembered and retold for generations, the young prince did something that brought audible gasps from the watching staff. He stepped back and, with perfect form and deep respect, gave Sergeant Mitchell a formal salute, not the casual acknowledgement that might be expected from a child, but a proper military salute that recognized the guard as a fellow servant of the crown. The symbolism was profound. Here was the future of the monarchy, saluting the past and present dedication of those who had served to protect it. It was a moment that bridged generations, honored tradition while embracing change, and demonstrated that respect and gratitude knew no boundaries of age or rank. Thomas, overwhelmed by the gesture, returned the salute with precision born of decades of training, but his eyes were bright with tears that he no longer tried to hide. The exchange lasted only moments, but it captured everything that service, honor, and human dignity represented. Around the courtyard, other guards stood a little straighter, their own eyes moist with emotion as they witnessed their colleague receive the recognition he so richly deserved. The castle staff watched in amazed silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that would become part of Windsor Castle's most treasured memories. As the formal salute concluded, something extraordinary happened that no one had anticipated. Prince George, instead of stepping back to maintain the usual distance, moved closer to Sergeant Mitchell. The young prince looked up at the guard's tear-filled eyes and, in a voice barely above a whisper, asked a question that would forever change how Thomas viewed his years of service. The prince asked the veteran guard to tell him about his proudest moment during his 32 years of duty. This simple request opened a floodgate of memories for Thomas, who found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone outside his fellow guards. He spoke of the day he had spotted a potential security threat during a state dinner, the time he had helped guide evacuations during a fire alarm, and countless other moments when his vigilance and training had made a difference. Prince George listened intently to each story, asking thoughtful questions that showed his genuine interest in understanding the depth and complexity of the guard's service. The conversation revealed the prince's remarkable maturity and his growing awareness of the sacrifices made by those who protected his family. Other guards, while maintaining their positions, strained to hear the exchange, moved by their colleagues' stories and the prince's respectful attention. Word of what was happening spread quickly through the castle. Prince William and Catherine appeared at a nearby window, watching with obvious pride as their son demonstrated the values they had worked so hard to instill in him. The sight of their 10-year-old boy engaging so meaningfully with someone who had dedicated his life to protecting their family filled them with profound emotion. As their conversation continued, Thomas found himself sharing more personal details about his service. He spoke about Margaret, his late wife, and how she had supported his career despite the long hours and frequent absences. He mentioned the letters she used to pack in his lunch, reminding him that his service mattered and that she was proud of his dedication to duty. Prince George's expression grew thoughtful as he absorbed these personal details. The young prince began to understand that behind every guard's stoic exterior was a full life filled with relationships, sacrifices, and personal struggles. This revelation seemed to deepen his appreciation for not just Sergeant Mitchell, but for all those who served in similar roles. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Prince George asked if Thomas had any advice for him as he grew older and prepared for his future role. The guard, initially surprised by such a question from someone so young, thought carefully before responding. He spoke about the importance of never forgetting the people who serve behind the scenes, about maintaining humility despite one's position, and about the power of simple gestures of recognition. Thomas told the young prince that leadership wasn't just about giving orders or making grand speeches, but about seeing and appreciating the contributions of every person in your service. He shared how much it meant to the guards when senior royals acknowledged their presence with a small nod or greeting, how these tiny gestures of recognition could sustain them through long, difficult shifts. The guard's words clearly resonated with Prince George, who nodded thoughtfully at each piece of advice. The conversation had evolved from a simple gesture of appreciation into an informal mentoring session, with the experienced servant sharing wisdom with the future king. It was a powerful reminder that learning and growth could come from the most unexpected sources. As their extended conversation continued, other castle staff began to gather at respectful distances, sensing they were witnessing something historic. The head of security, initially concerned about the breach of protocol, found himself moved by the genuine connection forming between the prince and the retiring guard. This was exactly the kind of moment that reminded everyone why they served the royal family, not just for tradition or duty, but because of the fundamental decency and humanity that the monarchy could represent at its best. The afternoon sun continued to cast long shadows across the courtyard as two very different individuals, separated by age, position, and experience, found common ground in their shared understanding of service, duty, and the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. As their conversation drew to a natural close, Prince George made one final gesture that would cement this moment in the hearts of everyone present. The young prince asked Sergeant Mitchell if he would be willing to walk with him around the courtyard, not as guard and protected, but as two people who had found mutual respect and understanding. Thomas, overwhelmed by the request, looked uncertain. Never in his career had he been invited to abandon his post for something so personal. But the head of security, who had been watching the entire exchange, gave a subtle nod of approval. This was clearly an exceptional circumstance that called for flexibility in the rigid protocols that usually governed such interactions. Together, they began a slow walk around the castle grounds. Prince George matched his pace to the older man's measured steps, and they continued their conversation about life, service, and the importance of finding meaning in one's work. The prince asked about Thomas's plans for retirement, showing genuine concern for how the guard would adjust to life after such a structured, purpose-driven career. Thomas admitted that he was nervous about retirement, uncertain how he would fill the days that had been defined by duty for so long. Prince George, with wisdom beyond his years, suggested that perhaps Thomas could find ways to continue serving, maybe mentoring young guards, or sharing his experiences with those just beginning their careers in royal protection. As they walked, other guards they passed stood a little straighter, clearly moved by seeing their respected colleague being honored in such an unprecedented way. Some of the younger guards felt tears in their eyes as they witnessed the recognition that Thomas so richly deserved. It was a moment that reinforced why they had chosen this career path, why they believed in the institution they served. The conversation revealed more about both participants than either had expected to share. Prince George spoke about the weight of his future responsibilities, his awareness that many people would dedicate their lives to protecting and serving him, and his determination to be worthy of such sacrifice. Thomas, in turn, shared his confidence in the young prince's character and his belief that the future of the monarchy was in good hands. Word of the extraordinary encounter had spread beyond the castle walls through social media posts by staff members and visitors who had witnessed portions of the event. The story began to capture public attention, with people around the world moved by the image of a young prince taking time to honor someone who had served quietly and faithfully for decades. Prince William and Catherine, still watching from their window, exchanged looks of profound pride. Their son's actions reflected not just good upbringing, but a natural empathy and understanding of leadership that couldn't be taught. They knew that this moment would be remembered, not just by those present, but would become part of George's character as he grew into his future role. As their walk concluded back at Thomas's original post, Prince George turned to face the guard one final time. The young prince spoke about how much he had learned from their conversation, how it had changed his understanding of what service really meant, and how he hoped to carry these lessons with him throughout his life. Thomas, his voice thick with emotion, thanked the prince for the greatest honor of his career. He explained that in 32 years of faithful service, nothing had meant more to him than this recognition, this moment of genuine human connection that had transformed his final day from a sad ending into a celebration of purpose and meaning. The two shook hands in a final break with protocol that seemed entirely appropriate for such an extraordinary day. As Prince George prepared to return to his daily routine, he promised Thomas that he would never forget their conversation or the lessons he had learned about true service and dedication. The guard returned to his post for the final hours of his career, but everything had changed. Where once he might have felt forgotten or overlooked, he now felt genuinely appreciated and valued. The young prince's gesture had transformed not just his last day, but his entire perspective on the years he had devoted to protecting the royal family. As the day drew to a close and Thomas prepared to remove his uniform for the final time, the ripple effects of Prince George's gesture continued to spread throughout the castle and beyond. Fellow guards approached Thomas with new respect, not just for his service but for the recognition he had received. Many shared their own stories of small interactions with the royal family, moments they had treasured but never thought significant until witnessing the profound impact of genuine appreciation. The changing of the guard ceremony that evening took on special significance as Thomas officially passed his duties to his successor. The usually routine procedure became an emotional farewell, with guards forming an honor corridor as he walked away from his final post. The younger guards who had served under his guidance struggled to contain their emotions, understanding that they were losing not just a colleague, but a mentor and father figure. Prince George, having returned to his evening routine, found himself changed by the encounter. At dinner that night, he spoke animatedly to his family about his conversation with Sergeant Mitchell, sharing the stories he had heard and the insights he had gained. His parents listened with growing amazement at the depth of understanding their son had developed about service, sacrifice, and leadership through this one meaningful interaction. The story of the prince's gesture quickly spread beyond the castle walls, capturing international attention. News outlets around the world reported on the young prince's remarkable display of maturity and empathy. Social media buzzed with praise for both Prince George's thoughtfulness and the royal family's apparent commitment to recognizing those who served them faithfully. Thomas returned to his modest home that evening carrying not just the crystal memento, but a transformed understanding of his life's work. The empty house that had seemed so daunting that morning now felt different. He was no longer just a retired guard facing an uncertain future, but someone whose service had been genuinely valued and whose experience could continue to matter. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself invited to speak to new recruits about the honor and responsibility of royal protection duty. His conversation with Prince George had given him new perspective on the importance of his role and new language to express why such service mattered. Young guards hung on his every word, inspired not just by his experience but by the recognition he had received. Prince George, meanwhile, began to approach his other interactions with castle staff differently. He made efforts to learn names, to acknowledge service, and to understand the roles that different people played in supporting his family. The lesson he had learned from Sergeant Mitchell about the power of recognition became a guiding principle in his development as a future leader. The crystal paperweight found a place of honor on Thomas's mantelpiece, but more importantly, the memory of that afternoon lived on in his heart. He began volunteering with veterans organizations, sharing his story not to boast about royal recognition, but to emphasize how simple gestures of appreciation could transform lives and give new meaning to years of service. The encounter also influenced royal protocol in subtle but meaningful ways. The family began to look for more opportunities to personally thank long-serving staff members, understanding that such recognition cost nothing but meant everything to those who received it. Prince George's spontaneous gesture had reminded them all of the human connections that lay at the heart of their institutional roles. Years later, as Prince George grew into young adulthood, he would often reflect on that afternoon with Sergeant Mitchell. The conversation had taught him that true leadership wasn't about commanding respect through position or authority, but about earning it through genuine care for others and recognition of their contributions. The guard's wisdom about seeing and appreciating those who serve behind the scenes became a cornerstone of George's developing leadership philosophy. Thomas lived many more years, enjoying his retirement while remaining connected to the Guard through his mentoring activities. He never tired of telling the story of his final day, not to glorify himself but to illustrate the transformative power of unexpected kindness and recognition. His story inspired countless others to look for opportunities to acknowledge those who served quietly and faithfully in their own lives. The afternoon when a young prince chose to honor a retiring guard became more than just a touching moment. It became a reminder that in our increasingly complex world, the simple act of recognizing another person's worth and contribution remains one of the most powerful forces for good that we possess.